So we've been really exploring together what makes you you, and you can just think about that during this talk. Think about for yourself, what are the moments that have made you you? What are the things that you were taught, the things that you were handed, the things that you broke free from, the difficulties, the challenges, the ups and downs, and really for in our conversation and in each of these conversations, we start at the beginning. And when we're thinking about spirituality, we think about what were the things that we first understood about spirituality from a young age. Maybe that was the type of religion you grew up in. Maybe that was just the type of family structure that you grew up in. But they have such a profound influence on us no matter what journey we go on throughout life. So Kathleen, I'd ask you, what was your spiritual journey starting from the beginning?
Sorry. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I love that clip that you showed, because this was definitely the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1980s. This is like, so I was born in 1947, and I was raised in Washington, D.C., in suburban Maryland, Roman Catholic, and that was one of the predominant religions at that time. So it was a very highly structured, and I guess, oh yes, so these are just some photographs, and this is really a history, because I think that we lead, especially if you've been around for a while, we lead successive lifetimes. Each decade or couple of decades of our lives is another lifetime that we enter into. But this is just kind of a brief history, and that top photograph is from 1908, and those are my grandparents. My grandfather was a second-generation Irish immigrant. My grandmother her family had been in the country for a long time, and they were just teenagers then in 1908. And then there's, just quickly, my mother in 1925, and a picture of my mom, a few pictures of my mother, and then my mom and dad in 1938. And then our little family in 1947 when I was born. Go on. And then this is kind of another lifetime when I was growing up as a child. Picture of myself and my older sister and my family. And then there's a picture of me making my first communion, which was a huge deal in those days. And then next, my teenage years, I kind of made a joke and said, when everything goes south. And you can see me in 1960, probably 1960, with the big bouffant hair. And then when I was in college at Rutgers University, and later on. Then, after I moved to San Francisco, there was another lifetime there. And animals were always a big part of my life, so I put in some of the dogs that we had. This was in the late 60s. I moved there in 68. And then the birth of my son in 1973, who is almost 50 years old. His next birthday, he'll be 50. And there he is when he was 25 there at the bottom photo, and in the 1980s or 90s, 1990s. The decades go on, and this is when I started my new life with my husband, Dan. We met in 1997, and then we were married in 1999. And then it just goes on from there. And that was our dog Lizzie, who was a border collie that Dan had. And then when Katie, my oldest stepdaughter, got married in 2002. And I mean, it just continues on from there, but that's about all we have time for.
What a journey, though. Thank you for sharing that with us.
And
I love those photos that you dug up. Those are amazing.
Yeah, and it just goes on and on. But yes, I was raised in the Catholic Church, and that was my biggest influence, my early influence. I would say for better or ill. There was a time in my life when I thought it was only for ill, but I have since come to find out that it was there were some good parts to it too. But I think, unfortunately, when you're raised in a very dogmatic and a very rigid religion, and especially as a child where you really don't question it, then you simply accept what you're told as being true. So you accept that you're essentially a stained person and that you have to kind of beg God for forgiveness. And so you're raised with that, and it really, in those days, I'm sure things have changed, but in those days, I always felt that the Catholic Church used guilt and fear as their primary weapons, to keep the faithful true. And I think that was definitely, I bought that one hook, line, and sinker as a child. But, then once I left home, I think I told you that once I was in my 20s, anybody mentioned or organized religion to me in my 20s, and I would start frothing at the mouth and fire start coming out of my ears, and I would give them a lecture, whether they wanted it or not, because I felt so bitterly angry, about what had been inculcated in me, and that I was still dealing with. And it wasn't until probably when I was 40 that I really wanted something. I didn't want to be, I wasn't an atheist. Even in my most bitter years, I wasn't an atheist. I still believed in something and wanted something beyond just the concrete everyday. But I had no idea what it would be until I discovered metaphysics, which is kind of funny because the guy was kind of very much into that, in the clip. But when I discovered metaphysics, that was really an opening into a spiritual philosophy that was not punitive. And the only thing I had ever known was a religion that was very punitive. And so this was an opening into more of a philosophy, not a religion, a philosophy that we're here to learn, we're here to grow, and that when you keep falling in the same hole, metaphorically, day after day or year after year, maybe you can stop and take a look at it rather than beating yourself up. So that was a big expansion for me and a big change. And then later on, I discovered the science of mind, faith, which is part of what they call the New Thought movement. And the New Thought movement started in the 19th century with Emerson and Thoreau and a lot of the thinkers who really wanted to put together all of the fundamentals of the major religions and to see where they were the same and kind of build a philosophy out of that. So it was based on compassion and service and education, but it was called Science of Mind also because they thought, well, we're co-creators with God, and so how we think and what we believe is going to influence.
Perfect timing.
Right.
And
I
ground yourself. Yeah. And we are one again.
And we are one. Oh, okay. So, I just wanted to, end kind of that little saga with my experience of my religious philosophy, my spiritual philosophy, which basically is just a story. And I love to talk about storytelling because it's kind of like, it's all story. This is my story. Doesn't mean anything for anybody else. It's just mine. I like it. So, when my husband will say to me, do you really think that's true? I go, well, I don't know. It may be, maybe not, but I like it. So it gives me comfort. It gives me what I need. And I guess that all came together for me in 2007 when my mom was dying. And she was back east in Virginia with my sister, and I flew back there to spend the last month or so of her life helping to take care of her. And my mom was a very traditional Christian. Of course, we've been raised Catholic, but then later on in life, she left the Catholic Church for the Episcopals because they were nicer, and she liked them better. But she still had a very, very traditional belief system. And about 6 months before she passed away, she started having these, I guess you'd call them breakthroughs. And I would talk to her on the phone, and she'd say, well, your dad came to me last night. My father had passed away in 94. And she said, and I was just overwhelmed with this feeling of love. She said, love like I've never experienced before, and it was God, and I don't know where it came from, and I don't deserve it, but wow, it was really amazing. And so she would periodically have these experiences. And so by the time I got out there to be with her, she was in the last month of her life and getting successively less able to move around. But she would talk about this to my sister and I, and she would say, there's something that's so amazing that's coming, and I am so excited for it. And then she would come back, more like come back, like, no, I'm going to get better, and I'll go back to my apartment, and this and that. And then she would wash into these experiences again. And to me, it reinforced what I already felt, and that I know we can kind of make fun of the word energy, but truly the energy around her was very, very light, and it was just love. And I remember sitting in the room one day while she was sleeping with her, and that's the room, the atmosphere in the room was just light and full of extraordinary love. And at the very end, I think probably 2 days before she died, she said to my sister, and she said, and myself, she said, I'm really sad to leave my girls, but I am so excited for what's coming next. And it certainly changed my life, my mother passing, but also the way she did it was, I would say like one of the peak experiences of my life, because it was so profound and so powerful. And when she did pass, it was very peaceful, and she was my nephew's wife was sitting with her. And I think my mom arranged that so that neither my sister nor I would be the ones sitting with her when she died, because she knew that one of us would be pissed off. Right? It would be like, really? Really, Mom? Oh, you chose her. I knew it. She knew we could be that petty, so she made sure it was my nephew's wife. So that really, for me, affirmed what I already felt in my heart, and I said, okay, I'm going with it.
What's so beautiful about that journey is it began, you started it with really the experience of your family of origin and going to church, and as you share with me, your mother was really the driving force behind being involved at church. And then that story wraps up with this beautiful spiritual experience with your mother that really defies the boundaries of what church taught you. I think for a lot of us, we go on these spiritual journeys where sometimes we kind of start and end in similar places. There's an author and a researcher on myth named Joseph Campbell, and he talked about what you could think of as the hero or the heroine's journey. And it's throughout story, through all of, pretty much all of recorded history and all of the great stories and all of our personal stories. There are some similarities, some themes that come up again and again and again. And he says this: the usual hero adventure begins with someone from whom something has been taken or who feels there is something lacking in the normal experience available or permitted to the members of society. The person then takes off on a series of adventures beyond the ordinary, either to recover what has been lost or to discover some life-giving elixir. It's usually a cycle, a coming, and a returning. And I think about your journey in this lens that, you began from this point where you could feel something lacking even in the beginning, the punitive and the judgmental nature, and you went off on a journey beyond the ordinary to really find what was missing, and then you come home to your mother, and yet you're able to share in this now transcendent experience. And I would encourage you to think, what are those ways in which you've left home, you've gone on a journey, and then you've returned in some ways to some of the same things, some of the same spaces that you began in, but you've changed. You're different. It's a homecoming. We talked about this just a couple months ago. This movement from naivete to disillusionment to second naivete, as we called it. Again, it's this pattern that happens again and again, and it allows us to return to some of these things. And so for you grew up Catholic, but yet you are here in this spiritual community that we gather together. We have ritual. We light candles. And we often talk about the words of Jesus and use the Christian symbols. We find them to be very meaningful here. And so for you, I just ask, how have you kind of gone through that journey of coming back to some of those things with a new lens?
Yes. I think once, you kind of, when you go through disillusionment, you tend to throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is definitely what I did when I was in my 20s. I ditched it all. And when you come back around through metaphysics, through all kinds of things, you see what was good about that original philosophy, which was the mysticism. I love reading the early Christian mystics, because mysticism, whether it's in Christianity or Sufism or Judaism, it's all about a person's direct experience of the divine. Their it's not about dogma, it's not about rules, it's not about any of that. And that to me is the most important piece. It's like we're all seeking something that is beyond ourselves, and the mystics are the ones who can talk about their experience of that. And that's very important to me. I also love ritual. I like ritual because I think ritual opens people up to experiences, to the experience of the transcendent or the divine. And it can be, through organized religious ritual, or it can be, going up to the mountaintop and howling at the moon, whatever, right? That works. In California, that works.
You're like, that's not a symbol. You're like, we
That's
do that.
Right. And so, yeah, I think that has brought me back around to really appreciate the parts of my religious upbringing that continue to be of value to me. I also liked, my mother was on the Ultra Guilds when I was a kid, and she counted the money. I still do that. I do that after every
Hero's journey. It came all the way back around.
Count the money.
Well, when we talk about ritual, for many of you might be thinking of spiritual practice, and I think the power, and we talked about this, the power of any kind of spiritual practice or ritual that you return to again and again and again is that we're learning to be present. We're learning to be in the moment, and it takes so much practice. That's why we call them spiritual practices, because it's hard, it's difficult. And so, yeah, if you have 30 minutes and you can sit down and meditate or pray, great. And you might be thinking, well, I don't have 30 minutes. Well, if you have 3, that's better than nothing. If you have 3 breaths, just use those breaths to be present. maybe look at your coffee, your morning coffee, as a ritual, and say, every time I fill this cup and I drink this warm thing and it wakes me up, that can be another moment where you say, I'm going to use that as an opportunity to reflect on my day, reflect on what I'm grateful for. And I love the ritual that we engage in here, because it can mean something different to each person, but yet we do it collectively in the moment. And one of the rituals that we do, that Denise so beautifully led us in today, and that you often take us through, is our meditation time together. And I think it would be easy for people to look at you and say, oh, well, she leads us in our meditations. She has the voice of an angel. She must be perfectly blissed and zenned out all of her life, you know. But we know that we're all human, right? And so, what are some of the ways that you've really taken your humanity and brought that into your spirituality?
Well, I'm anything but blissed out. That would be awfully nice, but yeah, far from it. Far from it. I think what helps me in times of where my humanity is really, really, really getting in my way is meditation, but also learning to surrender. And that was something that was a concept that I was taught early on. You surrender to the church, you surrender to Jesus, which I rejected. But surrendering is a way of simply letting go. And I have learned, most people know that I have an adult son with mental illness disabilities, and pretty severe. And there was a time where, before he got help and he was on medication, where it was a very, very terrible time. He was homeless periodically. I was afraid he was going to commit some act of violence. It was a really, really, really awful time. And I was always afraid. And I was always trying to save him and rescue him. And nothing worked. And so I went through this very long period of time. And I remember I worked for a social services agency, and one of my colleagues, who was a therapist, said to me one day, he may die. He may not survive. And that's something that you can't prevent. And that just really threw me. I was not prepared to admit or accept or any of that. I was just going to keep on, trying. And then at one point, when it was very much a time of crisis, and I didn't know what to do. And I had done everything I thought I knew how to do, and nothing was working. I had to surrender. And that for me was saying to God, I can't do this alone. I give up. I give up, and I give him to you. He's yours, because I can't carry this. I don't know what to do with it. And it was really hard, and yet it felt like, I'm not alone. I'm not alone in this. There is something greater than me that has some idea or something, that knows a heck of a lot more than me. And it got easier after that. So there is a way that I was able to surrender and then be able to actually think and get help and help him in a way that I wasn't able to help him before. That makes sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I think about what are the actions that we can take in order to grow and further our spirituality in life, so often it all simplifies down to that word of surrender, of letting go. Because how often do we need to surrender our expectations, surrender our attachments? I mean, at one point we will all have to surrender this life. And yet I think that love, which is really our highest value here as a community, love in so many ways is often an act of surrender, right? Because you're saying, I'm going to love another person by surrendering my idea of what their life or their journey needs to look like, and I'm just going to love them as they are. And that in itself is an act of surrender. Those of you who are in relationships, you know that it's a daily surrender. You're like, I'm going to surrender my idea of how long my socks should be allowed to be on the floor. Like, I have to surrender that, you know? I have to let that go. It's, you know, it just is what it is. But it's so powerful when we could do that, because the more we surrender, the more we let go, the more, as you're saying, we make space for something greater to enter into the journey. Speaking of challenging acts of surrender, both you and I have golden doodle puppies. How has Charlie shaped your spiritual journey? And we have a picture.
I think we have a picture of him here.
Oh,
Jordy, where are you?
Charlie, come out.
There he is on our favorite chair, right? That's our favorite chair. That's a nice red leather chair. And that's now Charlie's favorite perch. So having a puppy, as everybody knows, is a real challenge. And
some people don't know it, and like me, we don't know it until we get it, and then you're like, oh wait, that's what they were talking about. Uh-oh.
So I think the first 2 weeks we had him, I spent like, oh my God, what have I done? And why have I done this? And this is this little, he's just like this furry ball of peeing and pooping everywhere. And oh my God, and he's tearing things apart. And so literally, then you have to say, nobody forced you to do this. Oh, am I an adult? Oh, darn. Yeah, I am. So you have to surrender to what's being asked of you. And what's being asked of you, which you voluntarily walked into, is to be a parent to this puppy. Okay, what is being, and so then you kind of start on a different journey. Rather than feeling overwhelmed and tearing your hair out, you go, okay, let's see, how about puppy school? How about this? How about this? Getting him potty trained. And it definitely got easier once we surrendered to the fact of what was being asked of us. And I think that's something that, even though it's kind of funny because we're talking about a puppy, but truly surrendering is surrendering to what you're being called to do. You know, you're being called to let go of something, or you're being called to accept something. And once you do that, then it's easier to manage.
And just as we close today, I want to invite you to reflect on that. What is being asked of you? What are you being called to? It doesn't need to be something extravagant. It could be something as simple as loving, and I need to remember this, loving the puppy that you chose to get. But it can also be an act of forgiveness, like Denise shared, all those things that we can let go of and position ourselves towards in the new year. What is being asked of you, Aldea? To forgive, to love, to challenge yourself, to see beyond yourself, to embrace parts of your journey that are hard to embrace. What is being asked of you? I'd encourage you to think about it throughout these coming days, throughout this coming week. Now, if you are going to join us in just a few minutes as a part of Wild Church, we can continue to reflect on what is being asked of you. But if not, I want to thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing so much of your story.